She stood alone in the center of the ballroom, and not a single soul looked at her. It was her wedding anniversary. 3 years married to the Duke of Ashford, and Eleanor had worn her finest silk gown the color of pale lavender, had her maid arrange her dark hair with fresh pearls, had practiced her smile until her cheeks ached. She had chosen this night, this very public night, to try one last time. Because the Duke was home. For the first time in 7 months, he was actually home. She had watched him enter the ballroom an hour earlier. Tall, dark-haired, sharply handsome in his black evening coat, moving through the crowd with the cold authority that made powerful men step aside and eligible women watch with hopeless admiration. He had greeted the host. He had accepted a glass of wine. He had spoken with 3 members of Parliament and a naval commander and an elderly countess whose opinions he valued. He had not looked at his wife. Not once. Eleanor stood near the refreshment table, her gloves clutched too tightly in her hands, and felt the familiar ache bloom beneath her ribs. Around her, the cream of London society laughed and danced and gossiped, and she was invisible among them. The Duchess of Ashford, invisible. She watched her husband cross the far side of the room. She willed him to turn his head. Just a glance. Just the smallest acknowledgement that she existed, that she had waited 7 months in their cold, beautiful estate while he attended to business in the north, that she had counted the days until his return only to find he had arrived that very morning and gone directly to his study without greeting her. He did not turn. Something inside Eleanor cracked, very quietly, very cleanly, like thin ice giving way beneath a cautious foot. She set down her untouched glass of champagne and walked toward the terrace doors. No one stopped her. No one noticed the Duchess leaving the room. She stepped out into the cool spring night and stood alone on the stone balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, Eleanor stopped hopping. It was not dramatic. There were no tears, just a quiet, exhausted surrender in the center of her chest, and a single clear thought that settled into her bones like a final truth. He was never going to love her. She had been 19 when her father arranged the match. The Duke of Ashford needed a wife of good breeding and quiet reputation to manage his household and secure his lineage. Eleanor's family needed the alliance. It was business. She had understood that. But she had also been young and romantic, and she had looked at the handsome, serious Duke across the cold marble foyer of his ancestral home and allowed herself to hope. He had been polite, distant but polite. She had told herself that warmth would come with time, that behind his reserve was a man capable of great feeling, that she would earn his affection slowly, day by day, with patience and devotion. 3 years. 3 years of quiet efforts. She learned his preferences, managed his household flawlessly, received his business associates graciously, never complained, never demanded, never embarrassed him. She left small gifts in his study, fresh flowers arranged in the colors he preferred, books she thought he might enjoy. She memorized the names of every tenant family on every one of his estates so she could answer his questions intelligently when he bothered to ask them. He never did. The Duke was never cruel. He did not raise his voice or speak unkindly or embarrass her in public. He simply did not see her. She was a fixture in his home, a portrait on the wall, a signature on household accounts. She was the woman who managed his domestic life so efficiently that he never had to think about it. And she had finally accepted that this was all she would ever be. Eleanor stood on that dark balcony and felt the cold night air press against her bare shoulders, and she made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a vengeful one. She simply decided that she would stop waiting. She would stop hopping. She would stop shaping her entire existence around a man who did not know the color of her eyes when he was not looking directly at them. She would become the Duchess of Ashford in truth, not his wife because he did not want a wife, but the Duchess, the mistress of the estate, the patron of the village, the woman she had been raised to be before love had made her small and uncertain. She would build a life that did not require his attention. And if he ever noticed, if he ever turned his head and realized something had changed, well, that would be his discovery to make. The morning after the ball, Eleanor woke early. She had always woken early, hopping to share breakfast with her husband on the rare mornings he was home. She would dress carefully and come downstairs to the small dining room and wait, and sometimes he would appear and nod at her and read his correspondence in silence, and she would tell herself that his presence was enough. Today, she did not go to the small dining room. Instead, she ordered a tray brought to her private sitting room, the sunny west-facing chamber that had been her mother-in-law, before the Dowager Duchess retired to the countryside. Eleanor had never used it. It had felt presumptuous, somehow, to claim a space of her own when she was still trying so hard to belong in his. She spent the morning there, reading through the estate accounts, making notes in her careful handwriting. At midday, her housekeeper Mrs. Pemberton knocked and found her still working. "Your Grace, shall I have lunch laid in the dining room?" "No, thank you, I'll take it here." Mrs. Pemberton, who had been with the household for 30 years and missed nothing, hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Very good, Your Grace." By evening, the entire staff knew that the Duchess had moved into the west sitting room, and no one quite knew what to make of it. The Duke did not notice for 4 days. On the 4th morning, Alexander Ashford, 6th Duke of Ashford, came down to breakfast and found the small dining room empty. This was not unusual. His wife often took breakfast earlier than he did. What was unusual was the absence of the small touches that usually marked her presence. No fresh flowers on the sideboard. No note in her handwriting reminding him of an upcoming engagement. No second-place setting waiting hopefully across from his. He sat alone and read his correspondence and drank his coffee, and some distant part of his mind registered that the room felt different. He did not examine the feeling. He was a man of discipline and purpose. His father had raised him to manage his responsibilities without sentiment, to view his title as a duty rather than a privilege, to never let emotion cloud judgment. His marriage had been conducted on the same principles. Eleanor was suitable. Eleanor was gracious. Eleanor asked nothing of him that he was not prepared to give. That was enough. That was more than most men in his position received. If there was something hollow in his chest when he thought of her, he had long since learned to ignore it. After breakfast, he went to his study and worked until noon. At 12:30, his steward arrived with reports from the northern estates. At 3, he met with his solicitor. At 5, he reviewed correspondence. It was a productive day, an orderly day, a day exactly like every other day in his carefully structured life. He did not see his wife at all. The 5th day passed the same way. On the 6th day, he had business in the village and rode out early, returning late in the afternoon. As his horse approached the long drive leading to Ashford House, he saw a figure walking alone along the edge of the eastern meadow. A woman in a dark blue walking dress, her hair uncovered, her stride purposeful. It took him a moment to recognize her. Eleanor, walking alone, without a maid, without a footman, without the careful escort he assumed she always required. She was walking toward the tenant cottages, he realized, and she was carrying a basket. He watched her for longer than he intended to. There was something different in the way she moved, a quiet confidence, a self-containment, as if she were perfectly comfortable being entirely alone. He remembered, with a faint stir of something uncomfortable, that she had never walked the estate alone before. She had always asked him to accompany her. He had always been too busy. He turned his horse toward the stables and did not ride after her. That evening he dined alone. He told himself he preferred it. The change was subtle at first, so subtle that Alexander almost convinced himself he was imagining it. Eleanor no longer sought him out. This was not dramatic. She did not avoid him or leave rooms when he entered or behave with any visible coldness. She was perfectly polite when their paths crossed. She greeted him pleasantly, inquired after his day with the same gracious interest she had always shown, and then excused herself to attend to other matters. The difference was that she no longer lingered. She no longer waited in doorways hoping he would invite her to stay. She no longer arranged her schedule around his. She no longer watched him with those dark, hopeful eyes that he had learned to look past because meeting them directly stirred something in him that he did not wish to examine. She was simply living her own life, independently, competently, and apparently very contentedly without any reference to him at all. It was deeply unsettling. He found himself noticing things he had never noticed before. The way she spoke to the servants, with genuine warmth rather than distant courtesy. The way the tenants in the village brightened when she visited, which she did now almost daily. The way she had transformed the west sitting room into a space of quiet elegance, filled with books and botanical drawings and letters from the various charitable committees she had quietly joined. He had not known she loved botany. He had not known she served on charitable committees. He had not known, he realized with slow, creeping discomfort, very much about his wife at all. 3 weeks after the ball, Alexander attended a dinner at the home of Lord and Lady Pemberley. Eleanor accompanied him, as duty required, and she was as poised and gracious as ever. She wore deep green silk that brought out the warmth of her dark hair. She made easy conversation with the other guests. She did not once look to him for approval or guidance or the silent permission he had grown so accustomed to granting. After dinner, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room while the gentlemen remained with their port. Alexander found himself distracted, his attention drifting toward the closed door through which his wife had disappeared. He realized with a strange pang that he was curious about what she might be discussing in that other room. He realized he had no idea what interested her, what amused her, what she thought about when she was not performing the role of his duchess. "Your wife is remarkable, Ashford." The voice came from his left. Lord Henry Stanton, a young baron with an easy smile and too much charm for Alexander's taste, had taken the chair beside him. "I beg your pardon." "The Duchess," Stanton said, gesturing with his glass. "She's been doing extraordinary work in the village. My mother writes to me about it. The school for the tenant children, the new infirmary, the women's sewing cooperative that's keeping half the cottages solvent this winter. Remarkable woman, your wife. We're all rather envious." Alexander stared at him. He had not known about the school. He had not known about the infirmary. He had not known about any of it. "Yes," he heard himself say, "she is." Stanton smiled, entirely unaware of the ground shifting beneath the Duke's feet. "Lovely as well. You're a fortunate man." Alexander felt something hot, an unfamiliar twist in his chest. Jealousy, sharp and sudden and utterly unexpected. He did not like Lord Henry Stanton. He did not like the way Stanton had said, "lovely." He did not like the way Stanton was still looking toward the door, as if he might follow the ladies and seek out Eleanor's company. "Indeed," Alexander said, and his voice was colder than he intended, "I am well aware of my fortune." He set down his glass and rose, excusing himself earlier than courtesy strictly allowed. He did not go to the drawing room. He went to the front hall and waited in the shadows by the grand staircase, and when Eleanor emerged with the other ladies, he was there to offer her his arm. She looked up at him with faint surprise, genuine surprise, as if she had not expected him to wait for her. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was pleasant but distant, the voice of a woman speaking to a cordial acquaintance rather than a husband. Something in Alexander's chest tightened. He did not know what to do with it. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Eleanor's married life. She had stopped hopping and the world had opened around her. She had poured all the energy she had once spent on her husband into the work she had been too timid to pursue before. The tenant school had been a small project, an idea she had mentioned once early in her marriage, and Alexander had nodded absently and said, "If you think it appropriate," in a tone that clearly meant he did not care either way. She had taken that indifference as discouragement. Now she saw it for what it was. disinterest. And disinterest meant freedom. She hired a teacher, a bright young woman from the village who had been educated at a charity school and had nowhere to use her learning. She convinced the parish council to donate the old unused meeting hall. She visited every tenant family personally, sitting in their cottages, drinking their tea, listening to their concerns about their children's futures. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, at listening, at making people feel seen and valued. She had simply never valued herself enough to do it openly. Now she did. The school opened in late April with 23 students ranging in age from 5 to 14. Eleanor attended the first day, standing at the back of the room while the children filed in, their faces scrubbed and nervous, their parents watching from the doorway with cautious hope. She felt something she had not felt in years: purpose, pure, clean, sustaining purpose. She was needed here, she was valued here, not as an accessory to a duke but as herself, as Eleanor. She threw herself into the work with a fervor that surprised even her. There were long meetings with the village physician about the infirmary. There were letters to charitable societies in London, seeking funding and supplies. There were afternoon teas with the local gentry, cultivating allies and gathering support. She was busy from dawn until dusk, and when she fell into bed at night, she was too exhausted to lie awake, missing something she had never truly had. The Duke noticed. She was aware of him, noticing the way one is aware of a shift in the weather, a change in pressure, a watchfulness in his gray eyes that had not been there before. He began appearing at unexpected moments, coming into the library while she was working, asking casual questions about her projects, mentioning that he might ride into the village with her if she was going that way, standing in doorways, hesitating as if there was something he wanted to say. She did not help him say it. She was not punishing him. She was not angry. She had simply stopped carrying the burden of their relationship alone. If he wanted something from her, he would have to ask for it. He would have to reach for her. She would no longer bridge the distance between them single-handedly. It was terrifying and liberating, and grief and relief all tangled together, and she did not know where it would lead, but she knew she could not go back to the woman she had been. The woman who waited. The woman who hoped. The woman who slowly disappeared in a house full of silence. The turning point came on an evening in late May. Eleanor had been at the school until nearly dark, helping the teacher prepare lessons for the following week. She returned to Ashford House tired and satisfied, her mind still full of curriculum plans and supply lists. She did not expect to find her husband waiting for her in the entrance hall. He was standing by the great staircase, still in his riding clothes, his dark hair slightly disheveled. He looked as if he had been packing. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, unsettled. "Eleanor." She stopped, her gloves half removed. "Yes." "Where have you been?" There was an edge in his voice, not quite accusation but close, something urgent and controlled. "At the school," she said evenly. "I told Mrs. Pemberton where I would be." "You were gone all day." "Yes." "Alone." She finished removing her gloves and tucked them into her pocket. "I am perfectly safe in the village, Your Grace. I have been going there alone for weeks." He flinched, barely perceptible, but she saw it. He flinched at Your Grace, the formal title she had not used with him in private since the early days of their marriage. "Eleanor." He took a step toward her, then stopped. His hands were at his sides, stiff and uncertain. "I am not accusing you of anything. I am simply concerned." "About what?" The question hung between them. She watched his face, the strong lines of his jaw, the furrow between his brows, the way his mouth pressed into a thin line as if he were holding words inside. She waited. She had always waited for him, and now she waited without hope, without expectation. Simply curious what he would choose to say. "I do not know," he said finally. "I only know that something has changed, and I do not understand it, and I find that I do not like it." Eleanor felt the strangest sensation then, a flicker of compassion beneath the calm surface of her heart. He looked genuinely lost. He looked like a man who had woken to find the ground beneath his feet rearranged. But compassion was not love, and understanding was not apology, and 3 years of silence could not be undone by a single moment of confusion. "Nothing has changed," she said quietly. "I am simply living my life the same as you have always lived yours. I did not think you would notice the difference." She turned and walked up the stairs before he could respond. Behind her, the entrance hall was very still. Alexander stood alone in the marble foyer, staring at the empty staircase, and felt something he had no name for settle heavy and cold in his chest. She had spoken without anger, without tears, without any of the emotional displays he had always quietly dreaded and avoided. She had spoken as if he were a stranger, as if his concern were a curiosity rather than something that mattered to her. He had spent years maintaining a careful distance from his wife. He had believed it was necessary. Emotional entanglements complicated judgment. Affection led to vulnerability. His father had taught him that a duke must be ruled by duty, not feeling. He had married because it was expected, and he had been grateful that Eleanor was graceful and undemanding, and did not trouble him with scenes or expectations. He had been grateful. The word tasted bitter now. He walked slowly to his study and poured himself a glass of brandy he did not want. The room was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. He stood at the window and looked out at the moonlit grounds, and he tried to understand what was happening inside him. He had spent 3 years not thinking about his wife, and now he could not stop thinking about her. He thought about the way she had looked at the Pemberley dinner, poised and warm and entirely self-contained, a woman who needed nothing from anyone. He thought about Lord Henry Stanton's admiring comments. He thought about the empty breakfast room, the untouched place settings, the flowers that no longer appeared in his study. He thought about the early days of their marriage when she had tried so hard, the small gifts, the hopeful questions, the way she had looked at him across the dinner table, waiting for something he never gave. He had told himself she would adjust. She would learn to be content with the life he offered. She would stop wanting more. And she had. She had stopped wanting. And somehow, impossibly, that was worse. He set down the brandy untouched and went upstairs. His chambers were in the east wing. Hers were in the west. The distance between them had always been symbolic, and he had always been comfortable with that. Tonight it felt like a wound. He did not go to her. He did not know how. He did not have the words, the gestures, the instincts. He was a man trained in politics and estate management and the cold complexities of aristocratic duty. He had never been taught how to reach for someone he had spent years pushing away. But as he lay in his dark room, staring at the ceiling, he made a decision. He would learn. The summer unfolded like a slow, golden dream. Eleanor had never known a season like it. The school was thriving. 3 new students had enrolled, and 2 of the older boys had been apprenticed to tradesmen in the next town, opportunities that would never have existed without the foundation she had helped build. The sewing cooperative had produced its first batch of goods for sale in London, and the profits had been enough to repair the roof of the widow Hargrave's cottage. The village physician had written to thank her for her work on the infirmary, and his letter was full of praise that made her blush when she read it. She was happy, not the desperate, fragile happiness of hopping for love, but the steady, grounded happiness of doing meaningful work. She was surrounded by people who appreciated her, who needed her, who saw her as more than an extension of a powerful man. And yet there were moments when she caught herself watching for him, when her heart lifted at the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, when she looked up from her work and half expected to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with that new, unfamiliar intensity that had begun to flicker in his gray eyes. He was trying. She could see him trying in the awkward, uncertain way of a man who had never learned how. He asked questions about her work now. He rode into the village with her sometimes and stood silently while she spoke with tenants and tradesmen, his presence a formal, protective shadow. He began appearing at breakfast, not just at the table but genuinely present, making halting conversation, commenting on the weather or the news or the estate business. She did not make it easy for him. She could not. The wound was too deep, the years of silence too long. She had spent 3 years offering herself to a man who did not want her, and the memory of that rejection was burned into her bones. She could not simply open her heart again because he had finally noticed she existed. But she did not push him away either. She answered his questions. She accepted his company on rides to the village. She allowed the slow, tentative bridge to be built between them, plank by fragile plank. She did not know where it would lead. She did not know if she wanted it to lead anywhere at all. But she watched. She waited. She let him try. The first crack in Alexander's composure came on a sweltering afternoon in July. He had ridden into the village to meet with his steward and was returning past the school when he heard laughter. Children's laughter, bright and unguarded, spilling through the open windows of the old meeting hall. He slowed his horse without thinking, drawn by the sound. And then he saw her. Eleanor was in the schoolyard, surrounded by a cluster of children. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and was falling around her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed with heat and exertion. She was holding a young girl on her hip, a tiny thing of perhaps 4 or 5, and she was laughing. He had never seen her laugh like that. He had never seen her laugh at all, he realized with a sick drop of his stomach. Not really, not with abandon, not with joy. She had smiled at him over dinner tables. She had offered polite, pleasant expressions at social functions. But he had never seen her face transformed like this, radiant and free, her eyes bright with genuine happiness. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful, but he had looked at her the way one looks at a fine painting, acknowledging the quality without truly seeing the life within it. Now he saw her, and the sight struck him like a blow. And then he saw something else. A man was standing near the school door. Young, fair-haired, dressed in the simple clothes of a village schoolmaster. He was watching Eleanor with an expression that Alexander recognized instantly. Admiration, open, warm, unguarded admiration. The schoolteacher said something that made Eleanor laugh again, and then he stepped forward and took the little girl from her arms, and their hands brushed as he did so. And Alexander felt something rise in his chest that was so fierce and so possessive and so utterly unfamiliar that he had to physically grip his reins to keep himself still. She had looked at him like that once. She had looked at him with hope and warmth and the open expectation of love. He had looked past her. He had looked past her for 3 years. The realization was so sharp and so complete that he could not breathe around it. He had been given something precious, and he had treated it as an entitlement. He had assumed she would always be there, always waiting, always hopping. He had assumed her love was a permanent fixture, like the portraits on his walls and the grounds of his estate. He had been wrong. He turned his horse and rode away before anyone saw him. That night, Alexander did not sleep. He sat in his study until the candles burned down to stubs, and the sky outside the windows began to light. He thought about his father, about the cold lessons in duty and restraint, about the way he had been taught to view emotion as weakness and attachment as vulnerability. He thought about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and how he had learned to bury his grief so deeply that he could not find it anymore. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about the morning of their wedding. She had worn ivory silk and pearls, and her hands had trembled when she placed them in his. She had looked up at him with those dark, hopeful eyes. And he had felt something stir in his chest, something warm and terrifying, and he had crushed it down immediately. Duty, he had told himself. This marriage is duty. Do not expect more. He had taught himself not to feel, and he had succeeded so completely that he had not noticed his wife disappearing before his eyes. He put his head in his hands. Dawn was breaking when he finally rose from his chair. He went upstairs, not to his own chambers but to the west wing. He stood outside Eleanor's door and listened to the silence within. He did not knock, he did not have the right, not yet. But he stood there for a long time, and when he finally walked away, something had shifted in his chest. Something that felt like a door opening. Something that felt like hope. The storm came in August. It was a tempest of unusual ferocity, a late summer gale that tore across the countryside with howling winds and sheets of rain. The tenants in the low-lying cottages had to be moved to higher ground. The school lost part of its roof. The river threatened to flood. Alexander spent 2 days in the saddle, coordinating the emergency response, deploying workers, arranging shelter for displaced families. He was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and running on nothing but determination and strong coffee. On the third morning, the storm finally began to ease. He was at the edge of the village, surveying the damage to a collapsed barn, when one of his tenants rode up with a face full of panic. "Your Grace, the river, there's been an accident at the mill. The Duchess is there." The world stopped. Alexander did not remember mounting his horse. He did not remember the ride. He only remembered the terror, a terror so absolute and so consuming that it blotted out every rational thought. She was at the mill where the river had burst its banks. She was there, and he might lose her, and the last thing he had done was stand outside her door without knocking. He had never told her. He had never told her anything. The mill came into view and he saw the chaos. Water churning brown and violent, debris caught in the current, a cluster of people on the high bank shouting and pointing. And Eleanor. She was waist-deep in the floodwater, her dress plastered to her body, her dark hair a sodden tangle, and she was holding a child. One of the miller's children, a boy of perhaps 7, clinging to her neck as she fought her way toward the bank. Alexander was off his horse before it stopped moving. He plunged into the water and reached her in 3 strides, his arms going around both of them, pulling them toward safety with a strength he did not know he possessed. The current was vicious, but he was stronger, and he would not let go, would never let go, would drag them both to shore if it killed him. They reached the bank. Hands pulled them up. The miller's wife was weeping, reaching for her son. Someone wrapped a blanket around Eleanor's shoulders. Alexander stood in the mud, dripping and shaking, and stared at his wife. She was alive. She was unhurt. She was looking at him with an expression he could not read. "You came," she said. Her voice was raw. "Of course I came." The words tore out of him, rough and unguarded. "Of course I came, Eleanor. Did you think I would not?" She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. She was shivering violently, her face pale beneath the mud and rain. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. She was cold and wet and trembling, and she fit against him perfectly. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, because she was, and he had been a fool, a blind, stubborn fool who had wasted 3 years of his life not knowing it. "I am sorry," he said into her hair. "I am so sorry. I did not know. I did not understand. I have been a fool, Eleanor, and I have no right to ask for anything, but please, please do not leave me." She went very still in his arms. Around them the rain was easing. The villagers were drifting away, giving them privacy. The world was quiet and wet and new. "Alexander," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name in months. "I love you," he said, and the words came out broken because they were broken, because everything he had been was broken, and everything he could be was waiting for her to tell him it was not too late. "I love you, and I have loved you for so long that I cannot remember when it began. I was afraid. I was a coward. I thought if I kept my distance I would be safe. I did not know that I was losing the only thing that mattered." She pulled back and looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and deep, and full of something he could not name. "I stopped hopping," she whispered. "I had to, it was destroying me." "I know," his voice cracked. "I know, and I am so sorry. Let me hope for both of us now. Let me be the one who waits. Let me be the one who tries. I will spend the rest of my life earning what I threw away if you will let me." She looked at him for a long, aching moment. And then she smiled. A small, tentative, fragile smile, but a real one. "I do not want you to earn anything," she said. "I only wanted you to see me." "I see you." He touched her face, his muddy fingers gentle against her cold cheek. "I see you, Eleanor. I see everything, and I am never looking away again." She leaned into his touch, just slightly, just enough. "Then perhaps," she said, "we can learn to hope together." He pulled her close and held her while the rain stopped and the sky began to clear. And for the first time in 3 years, they were not two strangers living in the same house. They were a man and a woman, standing in the mud beside a flooded river, learning to begin again. Autumn came to Ashford like a gentle exhale. The harvest was good. The school roof was repaired. The village slowly returned to its peaceful rhythms, and the memory of the storm faded into local legend. But inside Ashford House, nothing was the same. Alexander kept his word. He looked at her, really looked, with the full attention of a man who had woken from a long sleep. He joined her for breakfast every morning. He asked about her work and listened to her answers and remembered them. He walked with her through the gardens and rode with her to the village and sat beside her in the evenings while she read, content simply to be in her presence. He was awkward at it. He stumbled over his words. He did not know how to be warm after a lifetime of coldness. But he tried, and he kept trying, and slowly, week by week, Eleanor felt the ice inside her begin to thaw. She had loved him for so long. She had loved him through silence and distance and disappointment, and that love had not disappeared when she stopped hopping. It had simply gone dormant, buried deep beneath the self-protective layers she had built. Now it was stirring again, tentative and cautious, like green shoots after a long winter. She did not rush. She did not throw herself back into hope. She let him come to her slowly, and she watched him learn, and she let herself be moved by his effort. It was enough, for now it was enough. The first snowfall came in late November. Eleanor woke to a world transformed. White covered the lawns and the trees and the distant rooftops of the village. The sky was pale gray and soft, and the air was so still that the silence felt like a held breath. She dressed warmly and went downstairs, and found Alexander waiting for her in the entrance hall. He was holding her cloak. "Walk with me," he said. She looked at him, this man who had been a stranger for so long, and she saw the vulnerability in his gray eyes. He was still uncertain. He was still learning. He was still afraid that she might slip away from him. She took the cloak. They walked through the gardens in the falling snow. Their footsteps made soft, crunching sounds in the fresh powder. The world was muffled and peaceful, and Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. Not excitement, not passion, something quieter, something deeper. Peace. They stopped at the edge of the frozen fountain, where the stone cherub wore a cap of snow. "I have something for you," Alexander said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small box. Eleanor's breath caught. "It is not a gift," he said quickly. "That is, it is a gift, but not the kind you might think. It is not meant to buy forgiveness or hasten anything. It is simply something I should have given you long ago." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, but not a wedding ring. It was a signet ring, heavy gold, with the Ashford crest carved deep into the metal. "This was my mother," he said. "She wore it every day of her married life. She told me once that it reminded her that she was not just the Duke's wife. She was his partner, his equal. She wore it when she made decisions about the estate, when she managed the household, when she spoke on his behalf." He looked up at Eleanor, and his eyes were bright. "I should have given it to you on our wedding day. I did not. I was not ready to share my life with anyone. I was not ready for you, but I am ready now. I want you to have it if you want it. I want you to know that you are not just the Duchess of Ashford. You are my partner, my equal, my—" He stopped, swallowed. "My love," he finished, "if you will have me." Eleanor looked at the ring. She looked at the man who had been a stranger, who had become a mystery, who was now, slowly, becoming something else entirely. She thought about all the years ahead, all the winters and springs and summers, all the breakfasts and walks and quiet evenings, all the work they might do together for the estate, for the village, for each other. It would not be perfect. He would still be reserved. She would still carry scars. There would be misunderstandings and frustrations and days when the old silence threatened to return. But there would also be this man standing in the snow, offering her everything he had. She reached out and took the ring. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, she saw that there were tears on his lashes. The Duke of Ashford, who had never wept in his life, was weeping in the snow for his wife. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and he held her as if he would never let go. The snow fell around them, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. And somewhere in the village below, the children of the tenant school were singing carols, their voices carrying faint and sweet through the winter air. Everything was beginning. Everything was new. Eleanor pressed her face against her husband's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and she let herself hope again. Not the desperate hope of a girl who did not know her own worth. The quiet, certain hope of a woman who had found it. The Duchess who built a life of meaning, who walked through the storm and came out stronger, who learned to stop waiting and start living. The woman who, in the end, was loved not in spite of her strength but because of it. The woman who taught a cold duke to feel, and who let herself be warmed by his slow, determined love. She smiled against the wool of his coat. "Happy Christmas, Alexander," she whispered. His arms tightened around her. "Happy Christmas, my Eleanor," he said. "Happy Christmas and every day after." The snow kept falling, and the world kept turning, and in the great house on the hill, two people who had once been strangers sat together by the fire and talked until the candles burned low, learning each other at last. It was not the end of anything. It was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.